Bam. Okay. We should be fixed now. I hope. I hope we're fixed. Let's find out. Dun, 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 dun. Hold on. We're going to figure this out. Did we fix it? Is it fixed? Can we tell? Is anything better? Let's see if it'll let me. It should be fixed. It's telling me that it's fixed, but I don't know if it's fixed. Works, Aaron says. Good. Okay, good. That's good news. So we should be good. Hopefully that fixed the sound problem. And I think we've got most things back. Good. Okay, good. We've got people back in. I've put in the new link. Everybody should be able to see that. The only place I haven't put in the new link is Facebook. I better do that really quick. Oh, technology, y'all. One of these days, we're going to figure out how to do this better. Okay. Now everybody should have the new link. Cool. Yay. All right. Now we can get started. I apologize for the technical difficulties. So what we were saying about the Gospel of John is that it's a weird gospel. And we're going to be looking at the first, a bit from the first chapter of the Gospel of John tonight, because it is it's one of the readings for Christmas. We don't read it every year for Christmas usually. If you're one of the people like me who really likes listening to a lot of the, what do you call them? Lessons and carols services. They usually read this bit in lessons and carol services, 9 lessons and carol services. So if you're one of those people who like those services like I do, you'll probably be familiar with this text. So let's get into it. We're going to read from John chapter 1, and it's verses 1 through 18 is what we're going to be looking at. So this is you kind of see, so when we look at the 4 gospels, we've got the Gospel of Mark, which basically just has Jesus drop onto the scene as a full-grown adult. And then we have the Gospel of Matthew, who gives us Jesus's sort of genealogy and tells us a little bit about Joseph, Jesus's sort of stepdad figure. And then in Luke, we get a bunch of stuff about Mary, Jesus's mom. So those are kind of the things that we have going on in the other gospels. But in the Gospel of John, we don't have any narrative of Jesus's like babyhood or childhood. We just get this really interesting poem essentially at the beginning of John. So that's what we're going to start with. So John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And if you have a Bible that you like, you can look it up in your Bible. If you don't have a Bible that you like, you can use Bible Gateway, which is what I'm going to be reading off of, and I'll put that in the links here in the chat so that you have it. Brian says, Luke, the Gospel according to Linus. Exactly. If you're familiar with the Peanuts Christmas, what do they call it? A Peanuts Christmas story? No, I forget what it's called. Maybe it's just Charlie Brown's Christmas. But yes, that's the one that Linus reads in Charlie Brown Christmas. But John is the one that people don't usually read at Christmas because it's not Jesus's nativity story, so people don't like it as much. But it's a really amazing poem, so we're going to look at it. So John 1 through 18, we've got the link in the chat, so you can click that if you want. I'm going to be reading the New Revised Standard Version, but you know me and how much I like translational differences. So if you're reading from a different translation that is not the NRSV, and you find like a cool difference between what you're reading and what I'm reading, let us know in the chat, because it's always cool to look at those translation differences. So let's get started. John chapter 1. So we're going to start with, let's just go verses 1 through 5, and then we'll talk about those, and then we'll do the next chunk, and we'll kind of do it chunk by chunk. So verses 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. So that's the first section of this reading, the first couple of verses. Were there any differences you noticed, first of all? And second of all, I'm wondering what this first bit reminds you of. Does this first bit call back any other Bible passages that you might be familiar with? Does this sound like anything else? You think about it, and I will spill water all over myself. The thing that jumps out to me the most, I always hate answering, like starting with my answer before you all get a chance to get into the chat, because I know that there's a delay on this. So I'm like, oh, should I say? The thing that catches me up is the first few words of this chapter. What are the first few words of the chapter? In the beginning, right? So it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Those first few words, in the beginning, is the creation story, right? Genesis 1. Yeah, Living Love put it in there. It's the creation story. And that's what John, the gospel writer, is trying to give us here. John's trying to say, like, hey, this is the beginning of something big. This is like going back to the like biblical Big Bang beginning, right? Is in the beginning here. And that's what John's trying to get us to think of. Brian points out that in the Revised Standard Version, it just says men instead of people. So yeah, the light was the light of all men instead of all people. Yeah, true. That's just the way that we translated Greek, because in Greek, it is men, right? Because that's what the Greeks were concerned about. They weren't thinking too much about language inclusivity at that point. But most more modern translations have it as people instead of men. But good point. Kid Flash Clone says, my first reaction is thinking about how this gospel begins with a reference to the end of how darkness will not overpower light. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think the interesting thing about that, though, is the past tense of that verse 5. So in my version, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it, or has not overcome it, is another thing. Because it's kind of in the past tense, it's this idea that there's this, that like this is not dark, light has overcome darkness, or darkness has not overcome light, in sort of the past tense. And so I would be hesitant to put that on the future tense, but I think that is what John would want to do. I think John would say that, like, this is going to continue to happen, that light is going to overcome. And of course, we have to be careful with how we think of metaphors of light and darkness, because we have to be aware of the fact that even though metaphors about light and darkness can be really helpful, and they're definitely biblical metaphors, sometimes we can use them for not great purposes in terms of connecting all the things that are dark with things that are bad. And that can be a real problem when it gets into situations like white supremacy and racism. So we have to be really careful about our metaphors with light and darkness. But I think John is definitely trying to tell us something here about God, sort of about the fact that, like, evil or badness cannot overcome God and goodness, right? So there's definitely something going on there, even though the metaphors can be hard to deal with sometimes. Sky says, in the NIV, it says, the darkness has not understood it. Yeah. So if you're familiar with the King James Version, the King James Version is, the darkness comprehended it not, which is such a amazing, beautiful way of putting that. And the reason that it's like that is because, this is just like a random aside about translation. The King James Version was translated from a Latin version of the Bible. And in the Latin version, that was what it said. It said, the darkness didn't understand it. And so that's why we have that in the King James and in the NIV. In the Greek, in the original Greek, it's overcome, not understand. But those are all just weird translational differences. Yeah, I really honestly, I kind of like the does not comprehend better. Like the idea that like evil can't even understand what God is. Evil can't even understand love. Yeah, it's what Living Love is saying there. That I love that idea because it's very it's almost, I'm trying to think of what, I feel like it's Harry Potter. I feel like in the last Harry Potter book, there's a thing about how Voldemort can't understand love and can't understand friendship. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. This idea of like the world, even not even just like bad stuff, but just like the world in general doesn't really understand how love works. It doesn't comprehend it. So I kind of like the comprehend translation, even though it's not really accurate to the Greek. I kind of like it. So yeah, that last one, especially, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it, or did not understand it. That's a classic verse, right? It comes up a lot, and it comes from this really beautiful thing from John. Yeah. So let's go on to. Well, actually, let's say one more thing. So I'm going to bring in our weird, interesting gender. Oh yes, Brian says plug for Harry Potter and the Sacred Text podcast. Yeah, if you are somebody who is interested in looking at the spirituality behind stuff, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text is a really cool podcast done by the folks at, I think it's at Harvard Divinity or is it Princeton Divinity? I forget which. A very interesting podcast if you're interested in that kind of thing. So I want to bring in our weird gender connection for this particular Bible study because there's a weird gender connection going on here. There's a connection between, like, I guess the first question that I want us to ask to get into this conversation or bit of this conversation is, what does the word mean? When John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Pretend that you are somebody who has no idea who Jesus is. Like Jesus doesn't exist. Pretend that you're somebody who was living in like the first century and you're just getting met by early Christians, but you've never heard about Jesus. And they told you that the Word was with God in the beginning. What would you think word meant? What do you think word is? Because for people that had never heard of Jesus, that was like a legitimate question. Like, what do you mean the Word was with God and the Word was God? What word are you talking about? So that's my first question for us is, what do you think word would mean? What do you think word could mean if we didn't automatically assume it was Jesus? What do you think? I'm going to give you a little bit of a weird background thing, but I'm interested to see what you all think first. I'll go back for a second in the text here because Living Love says, John also elsewhere says God is love. So it's interesting to notice A equals B equals C. God was the Word is love. So maybe for Living Love, the word means love. Maybe. Kid Flash Clone says the Torah, where Jews most found God. Justin, cool. I'll try to remember that your name is Justin. I'm sorry if I read your username sometimes instead. So maybe the word means the Torah or the scriptures, right, of the Jewish people. Arden says, does the word mean breath or life? So maybe that could be it. Living Love says love equals the word. Brian says, if we stick with the Genesis theme, it could be Adam and Eve. Yeah, so maybe there's something that, like, if John is trying to connect us to the Genesis story somehow, what could word mean in that sense? T says, word is when you connect to God. Aaron says, I always conceived of the word as what Justin says, the Jewish scriptures up to that point. Living Love says, love the natural law of the universe. So those are all possibilities for like what you might think word would be if you'd never heard of Jesus, right? So the word, this is going to be a hard thing to explain. The word in Greek is logos. So logos means word. But it can mean a lot of different things. There are scholars that actually say that logos is just not translatable in English. There's just no English equivalent for logos. We've decided to use word, but that's not exactly what it means. So logos can mean a lot of things. It can mean a sort of a concept or an understanding or a fact in some ways. Or it can mean a word. It can mean a lot of different things. Logos is a really strange word in Greek. So when John says the Word is with God in the beginning, it's kind of a weird wishy-washy squishy thing. We're not totally sure, other than John meaning Jesus, because we're pretty sure, like, once you know about Jesus and you read it back, you're like, oh, John is talking about Jesus, right? But the fact that he uses logos to describe Jesus makes it a weird squishy thing that we're not totally sure what to do with. So here's the interesting sort of ancient piece that I want to bring in here about gender, is that for a long time the word logos, or word, right, was associated with God, and it was associated with the Torah, right, with the Hebrew scriptures. So the folks that said that's probably what most Jews would have thought if they were like, oh, God's word, that's the Torah, right? So that's associated with God. But this other thing that is associated with God is wisdom, also known as Sophia in Greek. And the words logos and Sophia, word and wisdom, were very intertwined things. They were, many people considered them to be the same thing. The wisdom of God and the word of God are the same thing because God's words are full of wisdom, right? So lots of people think of wisdom and word, logos and Sophia, as the same thing. Other people, other ancient philosophers, saw logos and Sophia as sort of two sides of the same coin. That logos was sort of the male part and Sophia was the female part, which is a very binary, gender binary way of seeing things. But in general, the words logos and Sophia were really closely linked in the time that John was writing. And there are some scholars that think that John would have used the word Sophia, wisdom, except for it had that female connotation. And John maybe thought that that wasn't going to be as helpful for early Christians. So he chose logos rather than Sophia. So there's a little bit of like guesswork around that, but the reason that we have some of this, the basis of some of this argument, comes from the fact that Sophia, or God's wisdom, is talked about as being in the beginning with God in a whole bunch of other points in Scripture. So, for instance, I'm just going to read you a couple of little snippets. In Proverbs chapter 8, which is all about wisdom, wisdom is personified as this woman. And wisdom says, "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. Before, when there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs with water, I was brought forth. Before the mountains had been shaped." So wisdom, as this woman, as personified as a woman in Proverbs chapter 8, is seen as this thing that is with God in the beginning and helps God create stuff. The same thing shows up in the book of Sirach, which is actually a book that isn't in the Protestant canon of the Bible. You'll find it in Catholic Bibles, and you'll sometimes find it in study Bibles. You'll find the Apocrypha, which is this group of books that aren't really the Old Testament, not really the New Testament. People aren't sure what to do with them, but Sirach is one of those books. And in Sirach, wisdom, again personified as a woman, said, "Before the ages, in the beginning, God created me, and for all the ages I shall not cease to be." So there are all of these places in the Bible. Those are just a couple, but there are many others. There are these places in the Bible where wisdom, Sophia, is seen as a woman, sort of not a woman apart from God, but as sort of one of the faces of God. So God's wisdom personified as a woman, in the same way that God is sometimes personified as a warrior and sometimes personified as a husband or a father. God is also personified as wisdom in a female sort of aspect. So I bring all this together because there has been quite a bit written by scholars about this idea of Sophia, the wisdom of God, and Logos, the word of God, as these sort of parts that John is trying to get us to think of. When John is talking about the creation of Jesus, the creation at the beginning of the world, John wants us to think not just of logos and like logic and word, but also of Sophia and wisdom, the wisdom of God, and God's more feminine nature. and those things combine in Jesus. So there's some weird gender stuff going on here, which is really interesting to read about. And I'm going to put a article here in the chat box that you can read later if you want to read a little bit more about this whole thing. But there's a cool article that does sort of an overall, like, hey, let's talk about Sophia and Logos. And so if you want to read more about that, I just put that link in the chat box for later. Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting stuff about Sophia and the feminine aspect of God's wisdom as present in Jesus, which then, of course, scholars are like, oh, like lots of LGBTQ scholars, especially, and feminist scholars in general, even if they're cis straight women, they're writing really cool feminist theology. They talk about all of the ways that Jesus subverts gender expectations throughout his life. He constantly does stuff that isn't considered masculine. And so connecting Jesus to this feminine part of God right from the beginning is a really cool way of getting into Jesus's story. What does the incarnation mean if God is this sort of omni-gendered being that includes masculine and feminine and non-gendered identities and non-binary identities? If God is incarnate in Jesus, then how does Jesus act in the world, right? So there's a lot of cool stuff going on here with the incarnation and gendered understandings of God. So I just wanted to bring that into our discussion about these first 5 verses, because it's one of those things that you never really hear about, it feels like, or at least I never did growing up. The idea of like Sophia and Logos and God's sort of gendered aspects, I never really heard about those. So I wanted to bring those into us tonight as we look at those first few verses. So let's move on in our study here. So we're going verse 6 here. And let's read verse 6 through 13. So that's going to be sort of the next middle chunk. So, hold on a second. I want to read Brian's comment. Brian says, is this where Julian of Norwich got some of her ideas about Jesus as a mother figure? Probably. I mean, Julian was Catholic, and so there's a lot of stuff in these apocryphal books, these books of wisdom, that talk about wisdom, and wisdom, or Sophia, is much more prominent in Catholic traditions than in Protestant traditions. So I wouldn't be surprised if Julian got some of that from these wisdom texts. Sky says, one of the pastors at my church once said in a sermon that God is beyond gender. Yeah, I would agree, Sky. I think a lot of folks would agree that the idea of God, especially if we were going to talk about thinking back to the creation stories, right? If God creates people in God's image, and people are of all different genders, then God must have all those genders inside, right? Or as part of who God is. So yeah, I would agree. I think that's true. The idea that maybe that God is beyond gender, but that God also incorporates all genders, I think are maybe both true. But I like that. Thanks for sharing that. So I'm trying to make sure that we got everything here. Let's skip to John 1, verses 6 through 13. So it says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. So I'm wondering if there's anything that jumps out to you about that section right away. Aaron says, I like this thought that the direct evidence from Scripture that the diversity in gender is indeed still in God's image. Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence to sort of point in that direction. Evidence is the wrong word. There are a lot of biblical texts that point in that direction, I think. Yeah, that's a great metaphor. Living Love says, kind of like white light is made up of the full rainbow, the full spectrum of color. Yeah, that it's like, when we think about like color spectrums and how they work, light is all the colors at once, but we think it's a whole different thing, right? I think that's a great metaphor. Mary says, "Hi, I'm back. I had to save my mixes from 8-track." Hi, Mary. Glad to see you, and I hope you save all your mixes. Yeah, Mary's pointing out that there are a lot of different forms of life in the world, and maybe they're all connected in some way to God's image. I think in terms of what Genesis 1 says about people being created in God's image, I think that's a reason why throughout history Christians have understood people as being different from animals, but that hasn't really worked out great in terms of our care of creation. So I think there's maybe a little bit of an argument that could be made around that. Kid Flash Clone says the idea of adoption into God's family. I always love how they were adopted, and we too, future tense again, can be adopted. Yeah. So let's looking back at this, that first thing jumping out there. Yeah, the starting in verse 10 there. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who are born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. Yeah, that essence of adoption into a new family is huge, right? And we're going to see this in, let's see, it's coming above, or it's coming below here in verse 17. We're going to see this same thing. So John, if you're familiar with the writings of Paul at all, in any of Paul's letters, Paul often talks about this sense of adoption, right? That there are people that are born into a family line, and sometimes you can be like, I am part of this family line. It's in my blood. And that's like a very strong, for some people, that's very, very important. And for other people, it's much more important to have a family that you choose intentionally, right? And so Paul sometimes argues about that we've been adopted as people who follow Christ. We are adopted into Christ's family. And for Paul, being adopted into Christ's family is much more important than any family that we're born into. So John is very much kind of like, you can see where Paul and John would definitely be able to sit down and have coffee and agree on this, right? This idea of being of adoption being much more important, and what you choose being much more important. One thing that I think maybe that might resonate a little bit with a lot of LGBTQ plus folks, because this idea that I think for a lot of us, we maybe have a lot of struggles and like some tensions with our family, our birth family, our family of origin, right? That when we read that bit about his own people saw him not, accepted him not, loved him not, like all these things, we can kind of go, oh yeah, like for some of us, that's kind of relevant. It resonates. Like you come to your own people and they're like, no, we're not sure if we really want you. And so then you go to other people and they're like, oh yeah, we definitely want you. And there's this spirit of adoption into a chosen family, right? So I don't know, those couple of verses really speak to me about the experience of the family that you're born into versus the family that you choose. And I think that's something that LGBTQ plus folks are like we know what that's like, and we know what that feeling is in a lot of cases. That's something that can maybe resonate with us pretty deeply. Living Love says, I think John is trying to explain the context for understanding Christ, the concept of what Christ means rather than the individual that exemplified it, that all the other gospels focus on. It's a deeper understanding that he's presenting. Yeah, exactly right, Living Love. The idea here is where the other gospels talked about what Jesus did, John is trying to explain who Jesus was and why it's important. So John is the latest written gospel as far as we know. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all written earlier, and we think John is the latest written gospel. So John already knew, like he was walking around, people knew about Jesus for the most part, like within like Jerusalem and like the area surrounding. And so for John, it was like, yeah, we know what Jesus did, but like, what did it all mean? And that's really what John is trying to get at, is like the meaning underneath what happened. So for John, it's very much like, what does it all mean? Like the deeper meaning of all of this is what John's trying to get at. Brian says his own people knew him not, could be, and probably has been misused in an anti-Semitic way. Yeah. John has often been, this is one of the dark sides of John. John has often been considered the most anti-Semitic gospel, because there are a lot of places where John especially puts a lot of blame on the Jewish people, and like there are a lot of points where John associates all bad stuff and bad actions with the Jews as a whole, rather than like a specific group of authorities, which is more like what actually happened. So yeah, there have definitely been times when that has been the case. And I'm glad that you brought that up. That's something that really needs to be on our mind, especially with the stabbing at the synagogue recently, and like the way that anti-Semitism is rising in the US and elsewhere in the world. We need to be aware of the fact that a lot of times the texts that are our favorites are the ones that have done a lot of harm towards people of other faiths, just as they've done harm towards people of different genders. So we have to be really aware of that fact. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so I think that bit there, I'm glad that who was it that brought that up? Who was it? Somebody brought it up. Kid Flash Clone brought that bit up about adoption, which I really like. Kid Flash Clone says the anti-Semitic mindset came from the Johannine communities that surrounded this gospel, correct? Yeah, so from what we know about how early Christian communities worked, we think that the Gospel of John was written by and sort of put together by, compiled by, shared by a group of people who had been recently kicked out of their synagogues for following Jesus. And like, that makes sense, right? Like Jewish folks don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God or the Messiah. And so obviously they'd be like, hey, if you follow this guy who we don't think is God, then you should probably leave this community. Like it makes sense that that happened. But we think that the people who wrote John were like really bitter about that split, and felt really bad about, they felt really angry maybe about what had happened and how this rift had happened between them and their community. And so we think maybe that's why the Gospel of John is so rough on Jews and Judaism, is because they were dealing with, there was like a lot, they kind of had a chip on their shoulder. We think that's maybe what was going on. So yeah, if actually, I wonder if I have it here someplace. I probably don't, because I think I actually just, every once in a while I have to kind of get rid of a whole bunch of books that I don't look at that often. And I think I might have just gotten rid of it. But I have had a really good book about the Gospel of John on this bookshelf somewhere. And now it appears to be gone. Oh, shoot. I wish I had it, but I think I got rid of it. Oh, well. Oh, well. I'll have to recommend it to you at some other point. Jeremy says, what do you mean the people who wrote John? Are you denying John's authorship? Well, no. So the thing that's complex about a lot of these books of the Bible is that even though they have one person's name on it, a lot of times, even though one person may have written the majority of it, usually books were sort of compiled by a group of people. So maybe you had one person that wrote the majority of the book, but then you'd have editors that would come in and make edits. So I'm not saying that John didn't write the Gospel of John, but when we usually talk about a gospel or a specific book of the Bible, we talk about like the group of people that had it, that brought it together, because usually there wasn't just one writer, there were like writers and editors on top of that. So that's why I refer to the whole group of people involved. It'd be like saying, like, I wrote a book, right? But I also had editors that edited my book and made suggestions. So even though it's got my name on the title, I wouldn't be like, I'm the only one that did anything for this book, because that's just not true. Mary says, you have so many books, you should make a list of them or something. Yeah, I probably should. Aaron says, is there any serious theological disagreement that these books were probably not written by their namesakes? My pastor mentioned that last week, that these may be attributed to the community of John or the community of Luke, etc. Yeah, so basically, yeah, Aaron's saying like that's kind of what I'm doing when I say like the people who wrote the book of John. I'm kind of talking about like the community of John, like your pastor did, because we want to include the fact that there were edits done later, and there were Especially with some books, it's like you see that specific chapters are written earlier than other chapters. So that's why I refer to like this larger community. There is definitely lots of theological disagreement about who wrote different books. And that's especially seen in like the letters of Paul. There are several letters of Paul that scholars today look back and they like look at all the evidence and they're like, Paul for sure did not write these letters. Like looking at specific ones. There are specific letters that we're pretty sure Paul did write, but there are some that it makes no sense in terms of like timing and style. It wouldn't make sense to believe that Paul wrote them. And we think that what was usually happening, especially in the ancient Greek world, is that people would, like students of famous philosophers, would write things and attribute it to their teacher philosopher. And we think maybe that was what was going on, for instance, with some of Paul's letters, that people who were sort of students of Paul would write things and then sort of attribute it to Paul as as they were his protege. So yeah, it's complicated because some of the books were like, well, we're pretty sure that wasn't who we thought it was, but it's complicated stuff. There's a lot of disagreement. Am I missing anything? I don't think so. Okay. So let's go on to our last section here. So we're going to be reading verses 14 through 18, the last section of this text. So John chapter 1, verses 14 through 18. And it goes like this. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I have said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. So that's the sort of last section of this very heady bit. So I think the first sentence there, verse 14, is the one that like grabs me. Like out of this whole text, the two lines that grab me every time are the light shines in the darkness and the darkness did not overcome it, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. Like those are the two things that always really jump out when I read these texts. And I think one of the cool things about that particular verse, is the word that is used for dwelt among us. So if you're reading a version that says, usually it's like lived among us or dwelt among us, the Word became flesh and lived among us. That word for lived among us is actually, it's kind of a weird connection, but it essentially means like pitched a tent among us, or lived in a sort of the thing that people have connected it to is the word tabernacle, to tabernacle among a group of people. So tabernacles or booths were the things that the Israelites lived in out when they were wandering in the wilderness. So it's like, think about like a camping tent, really, is what it is. That would be like a tabernacle. And when we used to talk about when we read the Old Testament, we read about God living in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was like the special place where they kept the 10 Commandments and where God sort of lived among the people, was in this tent that was carried around with the Israelites. So when it says in John that the Word came and tabernacled or dwelt among us, it's this idea of God coming and sort of pitching this tent, this sort of non-permanent structure among people. And that to me is really, really cool. This idea, it's not saying like God came down into the human being of Jesus and stayed forever in that way. It was like John is explaining that like this whole thing was meant to be temporary. This idea that God comes down to live temporarily among people and then to leave again, right? In body, not in spirit, but in body. And so the idea of Jesus's body as a temporary dwelling structure, like a camping tent, is really, really cool to me. This idea that God came and tabernacled or pitched this tent, this camping tent among us, is cool. And one of the sort of foundational queer theologians, who I'm sure I have a book of here someplace. Is it this one? Yes, here we go. Marcella Althouse Reed, who's like one of the foremost LGBTQ plus theologians, she talks a lot about how this idea of Jesus camping among people is an example of the way that God refuses to be pinned down by our ideas about who God is. This idea that God is not like, I'm going to come down and build us like a house made of bricks that will never fall down. The idea instead is that like Jesus is coming as this thing that can't really be stopped or pinned down or like can't be organized by humans. It's instead as God kind of picking up and moving to wherever God needs to be, which is kind of cool. Yeah. So let's see if so Living Love is connecting that, and Jerry are connecting that to the idea that bodies are temples. And I think that probably was in the back of John's mind too, this idea, although, like I said, not like permanent structures, which is why this is so cool. This idea that Jesus is not it's not a permanent structure. It's a temporary way of being with people. So yeah, it's an interesting point, I always think. And then the verse 17, it says, the law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So there's this sort of thing that's going on with the Johannine community, or the people behind John. They are kind of pairing up the Christians against the Jews in this way. They're saying like Jews follow Moses, Christians follow Christ, right? So they're trying to do that pairing again, that we see throughout the rest of John. But noticing that they're not saying that like that the law is bad. They're saying the law indeed was given through Moses, but then you need more than that. So the argument from the Johannine community is not that the old community is bad necessarily, or the old way of believing it's bad. It's just that they believe that you need more than just that, which is a very sort of early Christian understanding of what's going on. So, and then the idea in verse 18, it says, no one has ever seen God, but it is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. So this idea that God is known through Jesus is sort of like the base to a lot of Christianity. It's the base to a lot of John's argument throughout the rest of the gospel. So that's sort of our big text that we looked at tonight, going through it bit by bit. I'm trying to think if there are other things that I know one thing that I was going to bring up, and it actually connects to that sort of like temporal dwelling among us thing. And that is the paradox that doesn't seem like, it seems totally logical to us, but to people in the ancient world, they would have been like, what, John, that doesn't make any sense. In verse 14, where it says, the word became flesh and lived among us. If you said the word became flesh, the logos became sarx. Sarx is the word for flesh in Greek. If you said the word became flesh to somebody in the ancient Greek world, they would be like, what? That doesn't make any sense. That's a paradox. That thing doesn't make sense, because word, or logos, this thing that is sort of still not translatable in English, was considered to be an everlasting thing that like couldn't be touched, couldn't be hurt. It's very heady, it's theoretical, and it lasts forever. That's logos, right? Whereas sarx, flesh, is perishable, is something that can be hurt, is something that can be destroyed, right? So when John says word became flesh, for people in the ancient world, they would have been like, what? What are you talking about, John? For us, because we've heard it so many times, we're like, oh yeah, of course word became flesh, sure. But that idea of word becoming flesh, or God becoming human, right, which is kind of what John is saying here, was so completely baffling to them, was so completely it didn't make sense. And so I think I want to appreciate the fact that that didn't make sense to some of the ancient folks who were hearing this message. The fact that they were like, wait, no, you can't, like, that doesn't make sense. Like, I mean, we kind of get the same thing today if we think about the idea of God becoming human. If we had never heard of the person of Jesus and this had never like happened before, and somebody was like, oh yeah, well, God just became human, we'd be like, what? And I think a lot of people feel like that still today about when non-Christian folks hear about like Christian doctrines, when people say, oh yeah, Jesus was 100% human and 100% God, people are like, what? That doesn't make any sense. You can't do that. That's not how math works. And I think that's the same kind of confusion that people would have had listening to John. Brian says, concepts like the Incarnation and the Trinity roll off our tongues easily from familiarity, but they're still difficult concepts. Exactly. Yes. The idea that we're like, oh yeah, 3 in 1. It's 3, but it's also 1. Yes, God or Jesus is 100% God and 100% human. Oh, sure. We just sort of take that for granted, but they're things that don't make sense. I remember when I was a teenager and was learning about the Trinity in Bible school for the first time. And I remember thinking, that is so infuriating. You can't just call something a mystery and be like, well, who knows? It's just a mystery. Like, you can't write off things like that if you don't have a good reason for it. I remember feeling really frustrated by that when I was a kid. That people didn't seem interested in finding a reason for how that could be. They just were content to call it a mystery. And I think lots of people maybe feel that way, that sense of like, you can't just say a thing is without having any evidence to support it. So if you're somebody who feels that way, I feel you. I understand. But I also think that there is something to recognizing the limits of human understanding. So when we think about the Incarnation, when we think about God becoming human, I think there's a part of it that makes sense to be like, let's get some like evidence isn't quite the right word because I don't mean it in like a scientific sense. But I think there's got to be some basis to your argument, right? What would the basis for your argument be? So for people that like, when we look at the Gospels, when we look at the Gospel and people's reactions to Jesus, a lot of times people would be like, well, how can you say that this guy is God? Like, how can you say that? And then the people in the gospel say things like, well, look at all the miracles he does, right? And there's several times in the gospels where people say like, nobody other than God can make the blind see and the deaf hear and the lame walk, right? So for them, their basis for the argument of Jesus is God is the miracles that Jesus did, right? So that's their basis for the argument. For us living today, we can't like test all of Jesus's miracles and be like, did this really happen, to try to get a basis for our argument. For Christians today, I think a lot of the time our basis for our faith is the faith of the people that came before us. And that's tricky stuff, right? Like, our faith is based on the faith of these biblical writers in some cases, and our own personal experience too. But I think we take our own personal experience and we put that into the framework of the faith that we have been taught, right? So I think sometimes it's hard for us to find bases for saying things like God became human. We're like, how can we believe that? And yet we do. There's a lot that we take on borrowed faith from others and our own personal experiences. Just to throw back for a second, we talked, I think it was maybe 2 Bible studies ago, we talked about like staying true to our own personal experiences. And I think that that's relevant here to what John is saying in some ways. Because John, like this whole first bit of John that we just read is the writer saying, we experienced this, we saw this, right? That's John's experience. And John staying true to that experience and talking about that experience is the thing that lends faith to all of us today, right? So I think it's a cool and important thing to think about, like, how do we stay true to our experiences of God and share our experiences of God that may lend faith to other people in the future or right now. I sometimes wonder about if the biblical writers, if they knew that what they were doing was going to resonate throughout the rest of history through so many other people's lives. And I doubt it sometimes. I don't think that they knew sometimes. And so that makes me think that today, the things that we're doing, the things that we're writing and we're saying and we're sharing, we don't know how those are going to affect other people around us and other people throughout the rest of history. So keeping that in mind, that we might be able to share those things to help other people. I don't know. That gives me some hope too, as I think about John and how John gives us hope. So anyways, that's me getting off my soapbox for the night about hope. But I think that's pretty much all I had for our Bible study tonight in terms of bringing up other points. So I think we're pretty much done for the night. And I thank you for your patience through all the technical difficulties. And now it looks like I'm turning orange again. So I apologize for that. Hopefully 2 weeks from now, there will not be another snowstorm and I will be back to the office where we have a little bit fewer, where we'll have fewer technical difficulties. So our next Bible study will be, it's January 30th, or it's December 30th today. So our next, oh, shoot. Actually, we're going to be mixing up the schedule. Our next Bible study will actually be on the 20th. Because on the 13th, I'm going to be speaking at the Bradbury Sullivan Community Center, LGBT Community Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I'm also going to be a lot of other places coming up soon. So if you want to know more about that, you go to my website, austinharkey.com, and I've got a whole speaking list so you know where I am. I'm going to be at Creating Change. I'm going to be at Q Christian Fellowship. I'm going to be other places. So our next Bible study will be on January 20th. So keep that on your calendars. I'll, of course, send out info about that through all the social medias. And that's the plan. So thanks so much for joining. And thanks also to all the folks over at Patreon that make these things happen. Thanks to all the folks in the Discord server, which is one of the Patreon perks. So if you go to patreon.com/Austin Lionheart, you'll find all of that info there as well. So thanks for being here, and we will catch you next time, everybody. Have a good rest of your night.